So, thanks for having me. I've just driven up here from San Francisco where I spoke at a high-speed rail conference, so this is a shift. So I've been doing social perception research related to the spotted owl controversy for 20 years. I've conducted more than 80 public workshops and 3 mail surveys. And I've talked to probably, maybe 900 people in the course of doing all this. And some of what I'm going to talk about derives more from those conversations than from the formal data analysis. But what I want to talk about is the thing that's been of interest to me and that I was originally funded to study, which is what I call social perceptions of acceptability, or perceptions of social acceptability, which are different than the perceptions you encounter in hearings and public planning meetings where you get stakeholders and experts and lawyers. I was more interested in, well, what's the origin of the popular sort of conflict and controversy that arose from the spotted owl, and which jeopardized the license of forest management for a while with the injunction and results of the Northwest Forest Plan. And so here's the outline of what I want to talk about. And I'll run through this fairly quickly. And so the basic problem of social perceptions is as complicated as managing a forest. And so this is a model I use in teaching the subject. And in the middle of the flow chart, the conceptual model, is the acceptability perceptions of the general public. And what they get from the bottom is sensory stimuli, and then from the top they get information. And of course, sometimes the information includes pictures. And we don't have time to get into the full explication of this, so I'll break it down into the key parts that I want to talk about. The first is something I actually haven't found very good literature about, but I'm positing it anyway, and that is that there's three sources of perception. There's analysis, and there's normative affects from what I'll talk more about in a minute, and aesthetic effects. And in this model, they come together, and the key point here is that they can either compound or cancel each other. And what may have happened in the spotted owl case is that there were analytic things from Forsman was mentioned and others that coincided with adverse aesthetic perceptions of the landscape, and the politics went adverse to forestry. And those things all compounded each other to produce the conflict and the controversy. But it could be that they cancel each other. You can have a negative affect in the general public here that might be canceled by a positive effect, general consensus or political consensus effect. And so what you want to do, one way to think about it is you want to avoid going past tipping points where the general public gets in the way. And those tipping points may happen when you get all three of these going in a positive direction or a negative direction, and of course the negative direction that caused all the trouble. So on the analytic side of the source of public perceptions is the stuff that most everybody in this room does, science-based decision-making. And we have lots of constitutional case law in our democracy that says that's how public decisions have to be made. It's paramount importance that we avoid basing regulatory or public estate decisions on arbitrary or capricious evidence. So our forest planners and managers are trained as scientists, and they do this stuff, and they should do this stuff. But there's a couple of problems with it. One is most of the public is disinterested and are unable to take an interest in this technical stuff. One thing I've learned in all these workshops and surveys is that the stuff we're going to talk about in this room is just glazes people's eyes over. So you have to. The other problem is that no matter what technical analysis you do and how you explain your decisions, most people, to the extent they use that as input to their decision making or their perceptions, they do so only to the extent that the final results, the final outcomes, forestry products, are consistent with their values or not, what they like and don't like. So the reason we do this, we base our democratic planning decisions in public forests on this stuff is because there is a high level of intersubjective agreement because it's science-based and because our culture most of the time respects science. But we have this low influence upon acceptability perceptions. So that has its virtues, but it also has a problem. And over here is the part of the model that is essentially politics. And that has to do with how people socially represent and socially construct values. And this is critical in the sense that people have values that all the time, they judge public decisions, but what gets them excited and creates a political movement against forests or in favor of forestry is what I'm calling social narratives. And people have affections from their past experience, they have ideological worldviews, they may have relevant religious views, and what they do is they construct a social narrative the world is very complicated, and we all need simplifications to understand it and form opinions. And so a lot of the narratives I've heard in my workshops have been, you probably remember these from the early 90s, as the people in the city are going to lock up our resources and deny my community its wealth and quality of life. And then you go to the city and they say the timber industry has taken over the public lands and is not doing sustainable management, and so forth and so on. So all kinds of social narratives are constructed, and they're very diverse. These affections and religions and ideologies are very diverse. And the key point is that those are things forest managers can't control. That's controlled by our cultural leaders, politicians, bloggers, activists, the news media. And so there's very low intersubjective agreement. This is the stuff we just don't agree on. Although what I found in my research is that most people agree on basic values, but they very strongly disagree on the social arrangements by which we pursue those values. And that has to do with ideology and religion. So then there's this part of the model, which is something which I'm calling primary aesthetic effects, or best categorized, and that's the word I use in my surveys, scenic beauty. What's the immediate aesthetic effect that people get from forest and forest landscapes? And they come from primary formalistic sensory qualities that the Forest Service and BLM manage through their visual management system. But research has shown that there are a lot of cognitive sense-making qualities that affect aesthetics, and they also feed into the analytic side of perceptions. And then there's also associative effects. You know, if you see something and you think, what does your experience associate with that? And what does that mean in a normative sense? Those feed into aesthetic effects and also into the social narratives. But to the extent that they produce an immediate scenic effect, that can feed straight into acceptability perceptions, and that's something that research has shown happens surprisingly strongly. And so the nice thing about this, about aesthetics is generally poo-pooed by managers because it's social science or it's intuitive or it's those weird landscape architects. But it's something you have control over, and it is highly influential on perceptions. So my argument is we should pay attention to aesthetics. So next topic is, well, how do forest attributes and aesthetics interact in producing perceptions of social acceptability? Well, this graph is from a study I did where I took 1,200, my responses with 1,200 people in Western Oregon and Washington, and both male and live group surveys. And what we did is, without giving them any information, half the people rated a bunch of large-scale vista view landscapes for scenic beauty, and half rated them for acceptability without any information. Later in the workshops, we got into that. And the key point here is just that among productionists, which is Bob Lee at University of Washington invented this term. Those are the people who advocate for timber harvesting. They see scenic beauty here, but they think even ugly landscapes are more acceptable than beautiful. So they're forgiving of scenic beauty, or they have low standards of scenic beauty, amounts to the same thing. For environmentalists or protectionists, as Bob Lee calls them, it's the reverse pattern. acceptability is lower than perceived scenic beauty. So there may be some beauty in the scene, but if there's clear cuts, they're going to reduce its acceptability. Interesting thing to note is that in more scenic stands, there's less disagreement. And it turns out the people in my surveys who weren't clearly environmentalists or timber advocates act in their perceptions more like environmentalists. So that's kind of a key feature of the politics. So I did another survey after that, which was a male survey. And this is a page from the survey. And so for each forest, I surveyed a bunch of forest treatments, and it gave 4 pictures. I spent a lot of my time in all these treatments, pre and post, taking thousands of photographs, and then I randomly sampled from them. Then I did a description of the forest treatment. This case, it's a 15% dispersed retention harvest with high down wood. And I had other members of the demo study that was one of my funders help me develop this description, and then let's ignore that question. And then I asked them to rate scenic beauty. I gave them expert opinion outputs for more relatively anthropocentric values, had them rate the acceptability of the forest on the basis of human needs, then a set of outputs from experts, some of whom are here today, and then had them rate it for wildlife needs, and then I had them provide a final total acceptability rating, and then they could explain it to the extent they wanted. And the best regression model for explaining those perceptions over about 800 people was this one, but here's a more interesting way to look at it. If you set each variable at its average value and solve for one at a time, you get an interesting result. The most powerful and linear influence on acceptability perceptions was their perception of wildlife habitat value. So that's the most powerful thing that the Forest Service and the BLM are paying attention to, and that's justified. But scenic beauty was also a strong linear effect. The vertical scales are the same in all these graphs. So this is also powerful, not as powerful as wildlife values. But interestingly, to the extent that people approved of the economic and safety value, the anthropocentric values, what they wanted to see was some attention to that, but not a lot. You know, people want some economic human value from the stands, but they don't want, you know, it asymptotes. So there's nothing to be gained by going the extra mile and producing more economic and safety value. And safety in this case was couched in terms of logger safety. We had to leave the fire thing out. I'm doing another survey on that now. And then, interestingly, this is a very weak factor, but statistically significant, had to do with how many trees are retained in a stand. And this included both young and mature and old growth stands. And so there's a slight rise in acceptability as you leave more trees. Then there was this sharp drop-off where it seemed that there was less acceptability for high stands that were with no thinning or harvesting. And part of that is that the productionists are very strongly opposed to not managing forests, and the environmentalists are somewhat discouraged by how ugly those stands can be when they're really dense. So that's nevertheless a weak factor, but these were the two non-linear factors in the regression. So I took that same data and invented, it turns out nobody else has ever done it, something called acceptability distribution analysis. And so here are the ratings people could make from -5 for very unacceptable up to +5 for very acceptable with a neutral option. And so if you just map the counts or percentages of all the respondents who make each of these ratings, you get an acceptability distribution. And here are the distributions that are most likely to be observed, and I named them all. The point here is that you can have consensus where there's one mode, or you can get conflicts, and extreme conflicts occur where lots of people are way out at the edges, of positive or negative, etc., and you get combinations and permutations. Of course, this is the thing you least want, is where there's a strong consensus against something. And so here's young stands. This is unmanaged, then a 25% retention, so that's a heavy thin and a light thin. And so the unmanaged forests, both at mature and young forests, exhibited this bimodal conflicted pattern, which reflects the problem, the cultural problem we have in the Pacific Northwest, which is that it looks like a little more than half the population thinks that forests should just be left alone and let nature do its thing. But there's a large chunk, almost as big, of people who say we should be managing forests, they need management. And there's a number of books and articles about this problem. You know, if we could resolve this conflict, a lot of problems would go away. But it's still there. But if you show people and give them the information about thinnings, you get a stronger consensus in favor. Even though there's a conflict about unmanaged forests, you get a stronger positive distribution for thinning. So what's going on with the agencies in terms of thinning is not going to cause a lot of trouble, especially in young forests. It's a popular idea. So here are the distributions for mature forests. And so here's an untreated forest. There's that same conflict, although for mature forests, there's even stronger favoritism toward leaving the forests alone. Maybe that's the 80-year rule. But here's a clear cut, and you have a strongly adverse distribution. Just a few people there in favor of clear cutting. And if you go to 15% dispersed retention, it didn't really matter whether you aggregated or, 15% retention, didn't matter whether you did dispersed or aggregated pattern. You get this similar pattern to the, well, not, you get an aversion response, but there's a solid chunk of people in favor. And then if you go up to 40% retention, it doesn't matter which pattern in terms of acceptability, not scenic beauty, you get the strong favorable response. This is the most popular treatment that I had in my study, the 40% retention. So if you map the mean, if you list the treatments that I study, including some old growth, by mean acceptability, what you find is the clear cuts are way down at the bottom, and there's a solid gain, a substantial order of magnitude gain, just going up to 15% retention. It's interesting, I didn't do this on purpose, just the mean acceptabilities lined up in a very neat, almost perfect way. All the 15% retentions were together, and then young untreated and mature untreated with heavy thinnings in between. Light thinnings is the most popular, and 40% retention harvests, regeneration harvests, are up there almost as popular as light thinnings. So that's probably an important result. Then here are the sub-perceptions of social and wildlife needs, which are in no particular order, just on there for information. And in the written version of my paper, I actually graphed this in a more interesting way, but we don't have time to go through that graph. So, how to manage forest densities to affect scenic beauty. So let's switch to the scenic beauty thing that we can control and that's influential. So here are the effects without regard to the absolute scenic beauty value of the initial forest, and I'm using a psychometric method of using signal detection theory to measure scenic beauty in the most reliable and valid way in terms of social averages. And so you have a clear cut produced, these are for study where I showed people, different people, the exact same forest before and after treatment, and then did that for many examples and then averaged them across people. So clear cuts produce a big drop, and you can see in general that an Northwest Forest Plan style harvest of an old growth forest was almost as bad as a clear cut. And then 15% aggregated retention, which essentially is a lot of clear cut looking like openings, was almost as bad as that. But in the thinning of young forests are up here, and they're quite good. And then this is a 75% aggregated in the demo study, which had small drop, mostly because these are random photographs, so a lot of the photographs don't show any harvesting at all because most of the forest isn't harvested. So this, intuitively, most of my results are pretty intuitive, but now they're defensively scientific, I guess. And that is, the more you cut, the less acceptable, less scenic beauty it is, and this is for in-stand views. So This is a fairly recent publication where I analyzed just mature forests. I ran out of money and couldn't stick the young stand stuff in, and I didn't have very good data. Thankfully, I was part of the young stand diversity study, although I wasn't funded to do from the station, or I was funded through Knudsen Vandenberg monitoring money, so that limited what I could do. But nevertheless, for mature forests, if you take density per hectare, and these are the Forest Service Scenery Management System scenic integrity levels, you have this broad, fairly favorable, it comes out in the moderate level, and you'll have to read my articles to see how that was estimated. It's this 400 to 1,500 stems per hectare. This stems greater than 5 centimeters. Is a good range for avoiding adverse perceptions of scenic beauty. And then in the mid-range is sort of neither beautiful nor ugly. You get the more than 1,500 and 100 to 400 density. It's only down here at 100 trees per acre or less that you drop down into the very low publicly adverse perceptions. For basal area, it's more fun. You actually get a very high scenic integrity area here, and in my written version, I switched this to 100. The black dots are the old growth, so this is your old growth range. So relatively few trees, very large trees, produces that, but you still get high scenic integrity levels with higher basal areas. It's just you're going to get more trees, probably smaller trees here, and here you get some big trees, enough to jack the basal area up, but not so many trees, and that's also beautiful. And it's only down here at 250, or excuse me, at 25 or 30 or less meters per hectare that you get the very low. So these results, that's the regression function, and these are the data points for the forests in the study. So what about alternative forest treatments, particularly regeneration harvest methods and scenic beauty inside forests? So here's a mapping of the treatments I was able to study. And a dispersed, low-down wood, 40% retention was viewed as just as beautiful as a mature untreated forest, the average mature untreated forest. And you do pretty well with a couple other 40% retention harvests if you do dispersed with high-down wood or aggregated with low-down wood. Then there's aggregated retention at 15% with high-down wood is essentially as ugly as clear cuts. And then there's some more problematic stands in here. So the 15% retention, which is the common practice, is still somewhat problematic from a aesthetic standpoint, although these two are still decisively higher than clear cuts. So I think that in general, the public is going to be pretty accepting of 15% NFP levels, although I wouldn't put them in scenically sensitive areas that are popular for recreation. That would be my recommendation. Whoops. So I took all the data and did a fancy statistical estimation to try to figure out I sort of have in mind people who have to write environmental impact statements for forest plans. And so maybe you've got a whole range of retention levels you might contemplate. And so this is the best I could do to estimate the function of what kind of scenic integrity levels you would achieve with different combinations. And it's kind of a hard graph to understand, but the key point is that dispersed retention rather than aggregated retention, and lower down wood levels rather than higher down wood levels are combinatorially effective at increasing scenic beauty. I would love to have done a graph where I had actual downwood volumes here and these things and scenic beauty there, but many of my examples came from the long-term ecosystem productivity study, which funded some of my work, and unfortunately they just had levels of downwood, they didn't measure the volumes, so I couldn't do that. So finally there's the problem of vista views. How do you produce scenic beauty that will promote acceptability perceptions in these important views? And so we have these historic three approaches to timber harvesting. One is sort of the logging engineer's optimum, where you lay out geometric shapes that don't have to be perfectly square. And another option, which landscape architects have implemented in high visual quality objectives zones of the forests, have been to try to shape the cuts so that they're a little more natural looking. And then finally there's the unharvested condition. So I showed these images and others to male sample of respondents. And here are the scenic beauty levels, and then this I modified a bit with photo simulation. And there's that, yeah. So then here are the conditions I tested. So we have a system here where we have dispersed retention patterns in regeneration harvests and aggregated patterns. And then we have retention levels, 15%, 40%, and 75%. And so we showed these to people, and here are the data results. But the graph that's important is this one, which is the harvest shapes, the irregular shapes that are circles, the squares are they're sort of engineered squarish shapes, and then clear cuts. And the key point here is that if you do aggregated retention, it really doesn't matter much. You're going to get adverse perceptions. Now, at 75% retention, they start to creep up in the caution zone instead of the adverse zone. But if you do dispersed retention, you get large benefits. And it really doesn't matter very much statistically whether you use irregular shapes or aggregated shapes. This is just barely statistically significant. This wasn't, even though it looks big. And then designing clear cuts helps a little bit, and that turns out to be a statistically significant difference. The lesson here is simple: to favor dispersed retention, and according to this model, it's at about 25% retention that you actually cross into positive aesthetic average responses. So I sort of recommend that you stick to 25% dispersed retention in visually sensitive areas. So that's the summary of the research, and I open for questions.
You laid out a beautiful scenario here about what people respond to. It looks to me like people respond to process. Have you ever queried people with first a picture of the process, like you did, and then moments later give them a picture, a view of the same area 30 years later for outcomes, and to get their reaction to that?
So what do you mean by process?
Clear cuts immediately after the implementation of this practice. Clear cuts or thinning or patch cuts or whatever.
Okay. I thought maybe you meant some kind of social process.
Get a picture of the same place 30 years later to see what got accomplished by that. And I'm raising the question because you did make the point that getting down in the 20 to 30 square meters per hectare got a very strong negative reaction, and yet that's exactly the level we have to go down to get a big, older looking stand.
Yeah, so I have two answers. One is, in my study plans that I submitted to the station for the LTP and demo study components, I included returning to these stands, and it's been 15 to 20 years already, and taking pictures and repeating the study. I'd love to do that, but it hasn't been funded. And it won't cost too much, perhaps, because I could just go back to the photographs points that got randomly selected. I wouldn't have to replicate all thousands of them. So I'd like to do that, but couldn't do that yet because it hadn't happened. But I would refer you to a recent article published in, I guess the particular I'm thinking of was in the West Journal of Applied Forestry by Ann Kearney and Gordon Bradley up at the University of Washington, where they did include 5, 10, 15, 20-year post-treatment photographs, mostly from the Capitol Forest, in their surveys. And they did find green-up benefits, similar to those that have been found in studies in British Columbia. They're disappointingly small. The only people who had what you'd call socially significant improvements in green-up perception in that first 20-year period at least were people like the ones in this room. The technical foresters really increased their acceptability perceptions, but everybody else, minor improvements. In vista views, which Bradley and Kearney didn't study, but which have been studied in Quebec and British Columbia, green-up does produce appreciable improvements in perceptions within 10, 20 years. I'd like to do it here eventually. The longer we wait, the better, I guess, until I'm dead or too old to walk in the woods.